JD Vance change de cap sur l'Europe, des paroles dures à un partenariat. Le vice-président JD Vance partage des idées sur la politique étrangère des États-Unis lors de la conférence des Leaders de Munich.
Good morning, everybody. Wow, what a crowd, what a crowd. Mr. Vice President, we're so happy to have you here this morning. This is obviously the highlight of our Munich Security Conference meeting in Washington, D.C.
I hope not, but...
It is the highlight. It's really a great honor to welcome you here this morning. Actually, for those of you who have not been regular participants in Munich, this is the third time already that the Vice President is participating in a Munich Security Conference event. When you came to Munich last February, your speech kicked off a pretty controversial debate about fundamental values, unlike anything we have ever had at the Munich Security Conference. And actually, we published a brochure, a copy of which you'll have on the way out, about the speech and the reactions to it from around the world. This intense debate about how fundamental values, how the freedom of speech, the rule of law should be interpreted and applied continues to this day. Sure. But when we prepared for this meeting with your team yesterday, we agreed, and they agreed, that today we should try to focus on current challenges of foreign policy, sure, which confront us together. So thank you again for making yourself available. We don't have a great deal of time, so I'll not come up with a long introduction, and I just want to get us started. The first time you came to Munich, you were still a senator from Ohio. What I associate with Ohio is the Dayton Agreement 30 years ago in 1995. I was at that time actually the German negotiator. So I actually lived in Dayton, Ohio for one entire month. So and why is this important? Because it was through U.S. intervention, that peace was brought about in Europe, sure, in the Balkans at that time. So if I may, let me ask my first question about the U.S. and Europe. A distinguished former U.S. diplomat, Richard Holbrooke, wrote almost exactly 30 years ago in a Foreign Affairs article that the United States is and should remain a European power. Today, 30 years ago, my question is, do you think that the United States should continue to see itself as a European power? In Munich, remember, you actually said, and I quote, "We are still on the same team." Are we, and what does that mean for the U.S. presence in Europe and relationship with Europe? First question.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, and I'm sorry my microphone apparently is broken, but we have another one, so that's good. So everybody can hear me now, right? Everybody can hear me? Great, good. So first of all, thrilled to be here and thrilled to have this conversation. I've been looking forward to it. And yeah, I do still very much think that the United States and Europe are on the same team. And I think that this is, sometimes I've been criticized as a hyper-realist, right? I think of foreign policy purely in terms of transactional values. What does the America get out of it? What do the rest of the world get out of it? And try to focus so purely on the transactional value of it that we ignore sometimes the humanitarian or the moral side of it. And I think at least with Europe, that's actually not a full encapsulation of my views, because I think that European civilization and American civilization, European culture and American culture are very much linked. And they're always going to be linked. And I think it's completely ridiculous to think that you're ever going to be able to drive a firm wedge between the United States and Europe. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to have disagreements. And of course, you brought up the speech earlier. It doesn't mean that Europeans won't criticize the United States or the United States won't criticize Europe. But I do think fundamentally we have to be, and we are, on the same civilizational team. And I think obviously there's a big question about what that means in the 21st century. I think, obviously the president and I believe that it means a little bit more European burden sharing on the defense side. I think that it means that all of us, frankly, on both sides of the Atlantic have gotten a little bit too comfortable with the security posture of the last 20 years, and that, frankly, that security posture is not adequate to meet the challenges of the next 20 years. So there are a lot of ways in which this alliance will evolve and change, in the same way that the alliance evolved and changed from 1945 to 1975 and from 1975 to 2005. I do think that we're in one of these phases where we're going to have to rethink a lot of big questions, but I do think that we should rethink those big questions together. That is a fundamental belief of both me and the president. And, you mentioned this is my third time speaking with the Munich Security Conference group. Obviously, the first couple of times were in Munich. And I always remember very fondly, of course, that the very first time it was as a United States Senator representing Ohio, and I'm glad you got to spend a month in Dayton. I love Dayton. It's kind of the closest big city, if you can call it a big city, to where I grew up. But on that first panel, I was on that panel, and also David Lammy, right, who at the time was a lowly member in opposition, and of course now is the great Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, and he and I have become good friends. So I still think that this European alliance is very important, but I think that for it to be important and for us to be real friends with each other, and I think that we are very much real friends, we've got to talk about the big questions, and I know that's an important part of what this entire group does, so I'm glad to be here.
Great, thank you so much. And I think the message has arrived in Europe that we need to carry a significantly larger share of the burden. As you know, we are all trying to spend more. Some are spending really a lot more. Others are lagging behind a little bit, but we're moving in the right direction, I think. Let me turn to a really concrete, urgent issue, Ukraine. The Trump administration, from what we have seen in the media, etc., seems to agree with most of us in Europe that, unfortunately, Russia does not seem to be really willing to end this military confrontation. If that's the assessment, if that's our collective assessment, could you talk a little bit about U.S. strategy going forward? We all want this war to end, and let me say as a very personal comment, I think the Trump administration did the right thing by starting this process of talking to the Ukrainians, talking to the Russians, but the Russians seem not to be interested in the kind of quote-unquote deal that could be offered to them. So talk to us a little bit about how you see the next steps.
Yeah, so let me say a couple of things about this. First of all, I appreciate your kind words about the administration. Obviously, I think it was the right thing to do for us to start the process of negotiation. I think for too long, the Russians, the Ukrainians have been fighting. Obviously, there's been a lot of people dying on both sides. There's been a lot of innocent loss of life. And our view is it's absurd that you've had this war go on for so long, and the two sides aren't even talking constructively about what would be necessary for them to end the conflict. And I think that one of the things that President Trump has always been very good at, and he's gotten a lot of criticism, unfair criticism in my view, from both the American and some of the European press, is what I would call a strategic realism or a strategic insight. In other words, you don't have to agree with the Russian justification for the war, and certainly both the president and I have criticized the full-scale invasion, but you have to try to understand where the other side is coming from to end the conflict. And I think that's what President Trump has been very deliberate about, is actually forcing the Russians to say, here is what we would like in order to end the conflict. And again, you don't have to agree with it. You can think that the request is too significant, and certainly the first peace offer that the Russians put on the table, our reaction to it was, you're asking for too much, but this is how negotiations unfold. And I wouldn't say, I'm not yet that pessimistic on this, I wouldn't say that the Russians are uninterested in bringing this thing to a resolution. What I would say is right now, the Russians are asking for a certain set of requirements, a certain set of concessions in order to end the conflict. We think they're asking for too much, okay? And then obviously, the Ukrainians matter a lot. They're the other side, they're the other party, at least to the direct conflict. And we have to ask, what is the Ukrainian, what do they need in order to bring this conflict to a successful completion? And we're going to continue to have that conversation. Now, what the president has said is that he will walk away if he thinks he's not making progress. And I think that, about once every 4 or 5 weeks, you will hear some American official or sometimes multiple American officials say, this is a week where we need to make another step. And in particular, the step that we would like to make right now is we would like both the Russians and the Ukrainians to actually agree on some basic guidelines for sitting down and talking to one another. Obviously, the United States is happy to participate in those conversations, but it's very important for the Russians and the Ukrainians to start talking to one another. We think that is the next big step that we would like to take. And why does that matter? The reason it matters is because, again, I mentioned the Russians, but also the Ukrainians have also been sort of, they've put a piece of paper in our hands that says this is what we would need in order to bring this conflict to a successful resolution from our perspective. And there's a big gulf, predictably, between where the Russians and the Ukrainians are, and we think the next step in the negotiation is to try to close that gulf. We think it's probably impossible for us to mediate this entirely without at least some direct negotiation between the two, and so that's what we focus on. But I'm not yet a pessimist on this. I mean, obviously, you know, the Russians and the Ukrainians are not there yet because the fighting is still going on. You know, the Ukrainians have said they would agree to a ceasefire, a 30-day ceasefire. We appreciate that. What the Russians have said, again, you don't have to disagree with it, but it's important to understand where the other side is coming from. What the Russians have said is a 30-day ceasefire is not in our strategic interest. So we've tried to move beyond the obsession with the 30-day ceasefire and more on the what would the long-term settlement look like. And we've tried to consistently advance the ball. One final point I'd make about this, I think it's probably wouldn't surprise anybody in the room, but there are a lot of people watching who are not in the room, is a frustration that we've had, frankly, with both sides, is that they hate each other so much that if you have an hour conversation with either side, the first 30 minutes are just them complaining about some historical grievance from 4 years ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Look, I understand it. I understand that people don't fight wars against each other without a lot of grievance and a lot of problem, but we're trying to, as much as we can, play a constructive role in advancing the peace conversation forward. And what I'll say, just to echo something that President Trump has said many times, but I think it bears repeating, is our strong view is that the continuation of this conflict is bad for us, it's bad for Europe, it's bad for Russia, and it's bad for Ukraine. We think that if cool heads prevail here, we can bring this thing to a durable peace that will be economically beneficial for both the Ukrainians and the Russians, and most importantly, will stop the end of the destruction of human lives. I think people underappreciate this about our president here in the United States is he has a genuine humanitarian impulse about this. He hates innocent people losing their lives. He hates even soldiers losing their lives in unnecessary conflicts. He just wants the killing to stop, and that will continue to be America's policy. But obviously, as all of you have seen, we'll navigate that policy and react as the parties bring their grievances to us.
Great, thank you very much. If I can just offer 2 footnotes to that. I think for us, Europeans living as neighbors of Ukraine and, if you wish, also as neighbors of Russia, we have begun to understand that what we're looking at here is not just the defensive war by Ukraine against the Russian aggression. It is also a confrontation that puts at risk all of European security. In other words, it's indirectly our defense also. It's not just Ukraine. And this is why we're so desperately interested in seeing that this comes to an end, hopefully. And I think the real trick for negotiations and for a conclusion of this is going to be that it's going to be lasting and not broken in the next 3, 6, or 9 months again. Let me, Mr. Vice President, since we have so little time, there are so many issues. If I